My name is Glenn Ford. I was 42 when this happened, born outside Oak Ridge, Oregon, and I had spent most of my life around men who trusted saw chains, weather windows, and axle loads more than rumors. I was one of them. If you had told me then that something could watch a camp for days, think about where you were going to move next, and make every old hunting rule feel small, I would have laughed and asked what you were drinking. I did laugh, plenty of times, at tree-lined ghost stories. That is the part I replay now, because I used to mistake confidence for understanding. People in our logging circle knew me for one thing besides showing up on time. I could back a loaded rig into tight landings on wet grades without turning the radio off and without blowing up at anyone spotting me. That sounds like a small thing until you have 40-plus feet of truck and trailer on a spur road built by bulldozers in a hurry, with stump crowns on one side and a drop on the other. You learn to read slope from your seat, watch your mirror edges like a pulse, and keep your hands quiet on the wheel. I liked that kind of work because it was honest. Good inputs gave good outcomes most days. You checked brakes, you checked chains, you checked weather, and you went home. I rented a modest place at the edge of town where asphalt gave up and gravel took over. 1-bedroom, tin roof, old cedar porch that tilted half an inch toward the ditch, and a motion light that worked when it felt like it. I kept it clean, paid on time, and did not own much that could not fit in a truck bed. My sister lived 15 minutes away in a small split level with her 2 boys. She had been widowed for 6 years by then. Sunday afternoons were non-negotiable for me. I would bring groceries or fix something, usually both. One weekend it was a fence latch, next weekend a sink trap, then brakes on her oldest boy's bike. That rhythm mattered. Work, family, sleep, repeat. It gave shape to the week. Fall gave me my second routine, the one I had trusted since high school. 3-day solo camp loops in the same federal timber tract east of town, where old cuts met second growth, and creek bottoms held cold air all day. I knew those ridges by contour, not by map labels. I knew where elk crossed in October, where wind curled wrong at dusk, where blacktail stayed just beyond legal shooting light, and where washed-out culverts could swallow a tire if you got careless. I hunted by sign and distance, not stories. If someone told me they heard something big in the dark, I would ask what the wind was doing and whether they had checked for bear scat first. The week I went in, rain had moved through in bands, not storms, so the ground held moisture without turning to soup. Perfect for reading tracks. I packed lean and methodical. Wall tent cut down, cot, propane stove, cooler, 2 tarps, first aid roll, spare batteries, and my old 12-gauge as camp insurance. Ranger rode in the passenger seat with his chin on the door and watched every mile marker like he owned the road. He was a black and tan shepherd mix, 8 years old, scar on his right shoulder from a bad fence tangle when he was younger. Steady around gunfire, steady around game, steady around people. If Ranger bristled, I paid attention. Back then, that was still a general principle, not a survival rule. Friday morning started ordinary enough that I remember details now with a kind of stubborn affection. The diner on First had burnt coffee and hash browns that tasted like salt and iron skillet. I sat with 2 guys from the mill and 1 loader operator from our side, all of us in mud-stained boots, talking about axle permits and whether the county would ever grade the South Spur before winter. One of them grinned at me and said, "You heading out to play Mountain Man again, Glenn?" I said, "We're 3 days, same loop." If I come back smelling better than this place, it is a good trip." We laughed, settled tabs, and split before first light had fully burned off the fog. Small town talk, small town timing, nothing dramatic. At the yard, I checked my truck, signed dispatch paperwork for the following week, and loaded camp gear into my older pickup, the one I used for hunting so I did not have to smell hydraulic fluid on my own time. My foreman saw the rifle case and asked, "You solo?" I said yes. He gave me that look people give when they want to caution you, without sounding parental, then nodded once and said, "Text when you're back in range." That was the extent of it. No warnings, no folklore, no omen wrapped in a joke. Just one practical man asking another to check in. By early afternoon, I was climbing the forest road network I'd run for years. The world narrowed the way it always did up there. Patched gravel, fern-heavy ditches, Douglas fir columns rising in dark ranks, slash piles silvering at the edges from old rain, and occasional clear cuts opening like sudden stadiums of stumps and alder. Cell service thinned out to nothing after the second cattle guard. I logged my planned camp coordinates in a notebook I kept in the glove box, mostly for my own habit, and turned down a spur that ended near a creek bend I liked, because it gave me 2 exits, if weather turned ugly. Setting camp was muscle memory. I parked with the nose pointed toward the main road, not because I expected trouble, but because backing in saves time when you leave before dawn. Tent went up with the boulder at my rear quarter, cot inside, stove under tarp, cooler latched and weighted, gear sorted by use. Ranger made a loop of the clearing, checked every stump, drank from the creek, and came back to sit by the fire ring with his ears loose. I still felt like the same man I'd always been in those woods, confident to the point of arrogance about what belonged there and what did not. That first evening I ate canned stew and hard bread, watched dusk flatten colors out of the underbrush, and listened to the forest do what forests do. Jays fussed somewhere upslope. Squirrels shredded cones in the branches behind camp. Water moved over rock in the creek with that regular cold chatter that settles your nerves if you grew up around it. I cleaned my spoon, set the rifle inside the tent, and sat with Ranger until dark fully arrived. If you had asked me then what I expected from the next 3 days, I would have said rain, maybe one decent buck sighting, and sore knees from climbing skid trails. I woke before sunrise, made coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in, and planned a slow loop around the drainage before committing to a hunting line. At first, I did not register what was wrong because nothing announced itself. No snapped branch, no fresh carcass smell, no sign of cat cover. It was the absence that worked on me. The jays were quiet, not moved farther off. Quiet. Squirrels that had been active near camp the night before were gone from both sides of the clearing. Even the creek sounded too loud, like somebody had turned up one channel because every other channel had been muted. I stood there with the cup in my hand and told myself, weather shift, cold pocket, predators passing through at dawn. Ranger was already up, but he was not ranging. He paced the edge of the fire ring, stopped, and fixed on one stand of furs uphill from camp. Hackles rose in a line from shoulder to tail. He did not bark. Ranger always gave at least one warning bark when he caught bear scent. This time he stared and breathed through his nose in short bursts, then backed up 2 steps without taking his eyes off that same patch of trees. I called him forward and he came to me, but when I walked toward that direction, he planted his feet about 10 yards out and would not cross it. Invisible boundary, same spot twice. I tried to reason it out the way I always did. cougar pressure could shut smaller animals down. A wounded black bear might hold tight in brush and put a strange edge on the area. An elk carcass uphill could attract enough scavenger traffic to clear songbirds for a while. Those were all workable models. I took the rifle, walked a careful arc around camp, and checked ground sign in damp duff where tracks hold detail. No cat prints, no bear scat fresh enough to matter, no drag marks, no circling ravens overhead. Just wet needles, old boot prints from my setup, and one place near my cooler where the surface had been pressed deep. I knelt and put my hand beside it. The print was longer than my hand by a couple of inches, with toe spacing that did not line up with any bear track I had seen in 30 years outdoors. Bears leave a broad pad pattern with a certain roll to the edges, especially in damp duff. This had depth in the front, less in the back, as if weight had loaded forward and then lifted abruptly. One stride impression only, no clean second print to bracket gait. I took photos with my phone anyway, using my pocket knife for scale, and stood there feeling annoyed at myself for getting unsettled by one muddy shape. By mid-morning, I pushed farther down the drainage to force a normal read on the day. I found nothing that supported danger and nothing that dissolved it either. No alarm chatter from birds, even in sections where the sun hit warm. No deer movement where I expected bedding transition. Just long intervals of stillness that felt deliberate, as if the place was holding breath. I caught scent twice on shifting wind, sour and wet and thick like fur left in a plastic tote too long. Then it dropped out so quickly I wondered if I imagined it. I told myself, decaying stump pocket, rot gas from soaked slash, anything chemical and boring. Back in camp that afternoon, Ranger refused to settle by the fire ring. He shoved himself under the pickup frame and stayed there with his chin on his paws, watching upslope through the wheel wells. I ate standing up because sitting made me feel exposed for reasons I could not justify. As light thinned, the smell came again in short gusts, never constant, almost as if something was moving along the tree line and checking wind direction before each advance. I scanned with binoculars until my eyes watered. Nothing visible. No movement I could pin to shape. No sound beyond creek rush and my own boots in gravel. Dark reached camp in layers, and with it came that same broad silence, pressing in from all sides. I clipped Ranger's lead to the rear tie point and kept him close. I checked my watch more often than needed, checked my rifle twice, though it was already loaded, and kept telling myself I was reacting to pattern disruption, nothing more. Men like me build lives on pattern because pattern keeps you alive around heavy equipment and steep roads. When pattern breaks, your body reads threat before your pride allows the word. I knew that from trucking. I did not yet know it could apply to something I had no category for. That first night, with the fur stand dark above camp and Ranger refusing to look anywhere else, I still believed I could name what was out there if I just found the right sign in daylight. I added 2 rounds to the side saddle on the 12 gauge, fed Ranger early, and kept the fire lower than I normally would. Because bright flame wrecks your vision beyond the ring of light. That felt backwards for camp safety, and I knew it. But the dark outside the fire was where my attention kept dragging anyway. I strung a thin line from the cooler handle to an empty metal cup and another from the truck mirror to a cooking lid. Simple noise alarms I had used before around curious raccoons. While I worked, Ranger stayed close enough that his shoulder brushed my boot every few seconds, and each time he turned his head upslope, his lip lifted just enough to show teeth. The night settled hard. Not quiet in the usual way, where little sounds stack and separate but flat, like a wool blanket over your ears. Creek noise still moved through camp, steady and cold, but everything that should have sat on top of it was gone. No wing flicks, no twig taps from squirrels, no little night chatter in the brush. I sat on my camp stool with my rifle across my knees and watched the same dark strip between 3 fir trunks until my eyes started inventing movement. Every 10 minutes I stood, walked a short perimeter, and checked the lines I had rigged. Nothing touched, nothing visible. Ranger tracked something I could not see, neck stiff, nostrils flaring, then shuddered once like he was trying to shake off static. Around 10, the sour wet fur smell drifted in again, then vanished. I moved my light in slow arcs, pausing where the beam hit alder leaves and black bark. No eye shine, no outline, just rain-beaded needles and the pale backs of cut logs beyond camp. I told myself that fear fills in blanks faster than reason. I told myself that if there was a bear, I would hear brush displacement or smell scat or catch pad prints in softer ground. I told myself a dozen things that fit my old framework, because the alternative was admitting I had stepped outside any framework I trusted. Near 11:30, I heard 3 footfalls uphill. Not random snaps, not slide noise from a branch dropping. 3 distinct compressions in duff, spaced wide, weighty, then silence. Ranger froze so hard his front paw stayed half lifted. I switched my headlamp to a tighter beam and aimed where the sound had come from. Nothing. I waited. 30 seconds, maybe more, then one more step, farther right, as if whatever made it had shifted laterally to keep angle on camp. I realized then that I was tracking it, and it was tracking me back. I stood there with the light raised and felt my pulse in my fingers. The cup line near the cooler trembled once but did not clatter. The lid line by the truck stayed still. I heard a low exhale from somewhere beyond the edge of the beam, deep enough to carry through my chest instead of my ears. Not a huff like deer, not a bear popping jaws, just a long, controlled breath, close enough to matter. Ranger gave one suppressed whine and pressed against my leg. I clicked off the headlamp for 2 seconds to reset my night sight, then clicked it on again. Empty trees, empty brush. That same strip of darkness where the ground rose into fur. I kept watch until just before dawn, refusing to crawl into the tent. Every time my concentration slipped, I snapped back to that same instinct that said I was being observed from multiple angles, as if a line was being drawn around us. When gray light finally reached the clearing, I started at the cooler and worked outward. The ground held better than I expected. I found my own boot impressions, Ranger's tracks, and 2 new marks along the downwind side where no one should have been walking. They were not clean tracks, more like partial placements with pressure at the foredge and a shallow heel, long and narrow with toe marks set farther apart than bare. One was turned inward toward the tent, not toward food, and that detail sat wrong in my stomach. I followed those marks another 15 yards and found where brush had been compressed in a low pocket behind a rotten stump. From there you could see my tent door, fire ring, and truck in one view, while staying concealed from camp light. Needles were flattened, still damp, and there was that same sour musk caught in the bark. I put my hand on the depression to gauge freshness and felt the ground still cool and recently packed. a hunter blind. That was my first clear word for it. Something had selected a watch position downwind with line of sight on where I slept. Predators do that. Big cats do that. People do that too, if they mean harm. I stood up too fast, scanned the tree line, and felt anger push through fear, because anger is easier to carry. I packed a day kit, clipped Ranger's lead to my belt, and decided to run the drainage systematically. If there was a cougar using the area, I would find scrape marks, cached remains, drag lines, or at least clear paw registration in mud near creek edges. If it was a bear with odd gait from injury, I would find droppings, turned logs, clawing on bark at realistic height. If it was a person messing with camps, I would find boot tread, cigarette filters, food wrappers, anything human leaves behind when they think no one is looking. The first 2 miles gave me nothing that made sense. No cat sign, no bear sign, no elk carcass, no coyote activity worth mentioning. Even Ranger stopped checking side trails and stayed pinned to my left knee, which he never did unless thunder was close or gunfire had gone off nearby. At a muddy seep crossing, I found one clearer track, long and front-loaded the same way as camp, with a stride too stretched for a normal biped walking relaxed. I measured it with my knife handle and compared it to my own step. It was nearly a third longer, and the depth in saturated mud suggested heavy mass, but the edges were too sharp to be old. I crouched there for a full minute, trying to fit it into a known animal and coming up empty. By noon, I was irritated, hungry, and starting to doubt my own read. That is the dangerous part. When your brain wants normal so badly, it begins sanding down evidence. I ate jerky on a log and stared at the opposite ridge where old slash piles sat under fog. I remembered all the times I had teased guys at the yard for telling stories after a night shift and too much bad coffee. I had said things like, "You saw a stump and promoted it to a monster." It had felt clever then. Sitting there with Ranger refusing to leave contact distance, it felt like a debt coming due. I decided to get outside the drainage and call someone who knew the ground from heavy equipment routes, not hunting lanes. The nearest repeater hit from a bald knob above an old skid trail, so I climbed, sweating through my flannel, and keyed the handheld. Static at first, then a burst of voices. I recognized Jim Pike from dispatch and Aaron Bell from loading crew. I gave them my position and asked if anyone had reports of a strange bear or aggressive dog pack around the east tract. Jim laughed before I finished. "Glenn, you finally get spooked by your own shadow up there?" Aaron cut in, amused. "Probably a wet bear standing to scratch and you wrote poetry around the print." I said, "I know bear. This is not bear sign. Stride is wrong, toe spreads wrong, and the whole drainage is shut down. No birds, no squirrels, nothing." Jim came back. "Could be weather pocket, could be cat moving through. Pack it in if it bugs you, buddy." There was more chuckling in the channel, not mean exactly, but dismissive in that way crews get when they think you are overcooked from too much solo time. I almost signed off there, then another voice stepped in, lower and slower. Wayne Harmon, older loader operator, same man who had been at the diner. He did not laugh. He asked, "You getting that sour dog wet smell in bursts?" My throat tightened. "Yeah." A pause. Static hissed. Then he said, "If the silence comes back tonight, do not stay a third night. You hearing me, Glenn?" I said, "You saying you have seen this?" Another pause, longer. "I am saying do not stay a third night. Break camp tomorrow, daylight, no hero work." Jim tried to lighten it. "Wayne's winding you up." Wayne ignored him and added, "Check your camp perimeter before dusk, high, not just ground level." Then he dropped off channel. I stood on that ridge with the radio in my hand and wind pushing mist past my face, and for the first time I felt truly off balance. Wayne was not a storyteller. He was the kind of man who spoke 3 sentences a shift unless something mechanical was about to fail, and then you listened. I wanted to call him back private, but the repeater traffic got noisy and then broke up. I clipped the radio away and started down fast, heart beating harder than the climb justified. Back at camp, I switched from hunting mode to defense mode. I moved the tent tight against the boulder so one side was physically blocked. I hoisted food higher between 2 furs and ran a second cord line with bells from my tackle box. I staged the 12-gauge by the cot, shells in reachable order, and kept my rifle propped at the truck door. From my gear tote, I found orange reflective survey tape I used for marking blood trails in low light and tied short strips around trees in a 10-yard ring. If anything crossed, brushed, or twisted them, I wanted directional clues by flashlight. Ranger refused to help my mood. He crawled under the truck before sunset and would only come out when I clipped his lead and physically brought him to eat. He swallowed fast and tried to retreat under the frame again. I sat on the tailgate cleaning mud from my boots and watched the tree line through mirrored tape flickers. Around me, the forest held that same unnatural stillness, and even the creek seemed distant now, like sound from another drainage entirely. At full dark, I made my first perimeter check. Most tape hung straight. 2 strips on the uphill side were twisted into tight spirals. Knots cinched harder than I had tied them, and one had been pulled high enough that it sat near my shoulder line instead of chest line. Wind can spin tape, sure. Wind does not retie knots. I cut those pieces free, retied fresh markers, and marked the trunk with a charcoal X, so I would know if I was misremembering height later. When I turned toward the cooler, Ranger gave a sharp, strangled bark and flattened himself under the truck again. I brought the light down and saw 3 fresh gouges in the cooler lid, parallel and evenly spaced, not deep enough to puncture plastic, but clean enough to leave curled shavings at the end of each line. They started near the latch and ended short, like something had tested material hardness, not tried to rip it open. I touched the grooves and felt fine grit embedded in the cuts, as if the claw tips had carried soil or stone dust. That was the moment the last of my denial broke. Not because of size, not because of smell, but because the pattern was methodical. Perimeter touched high and low. Blind built downwind. Food ignored. Access points tested. I stood there with my light shaking in my hand and understood, in a way that sat cold and immediate, that whatever had moved around my camp was not wandering through. It was studying us. It was studying us. And once that thought landed, I could not set it down. I stood over that cooler with the flashlight angled across the gouges, listening to Ranger pant under the truck, and feeling every small sound in camp come in too sharp. The plastic lid clicked as it cooled. Water moved in the creek. Somewhere far down the drainage, a branch let go and fell with a soft rattle through younger growth. Nothing close answered. I ran my thumb across each scored line one more time, then snapped the lid shut and looped a ratchet strap around it so tight the corners bowed. It was busy work and I knew it, but busy work gave my hands something to do besides shake. I changed the layout again. 12 gauge, leaning against the front tire where I could reach it from either side of the truck. Rifle on the tailgate with the sling loose, headlamp around my neck instead of on my forehead so I would not throw light every time I turned. I killed the lantern, banked the fire until only a low red bed remained, and sat on an overturned tote with my back to the boulder and a view of the uphill tape markers. Ranger would not come out even when I knelt and called him in the tone he trusted. He stayed wedged behind the passenger side front wheel, eyes fixed through the gap under the bumper toward the fur stand, body rigid in a way that looked painful. I checked my watch at 12:14, then 12:26, then 12:41. Time was still moving, but it did not feel like it belonged to me. The first thing I noticed was smell, not sound. That sour, wet fur musk slipped in from upslope, thick enough to coat my tongue, then thinned out as if someone had opened and closed a door. I lifted my head and breathed through my mouth, trying to separate rot from animal from my own fear sweat. While I did, 2 strips of survey tape on the left perimeter lifted and twisted, not from a steady wind, but in 2 quick jerks, like brush contact. I brought the flashlight up and held the beam low to preserve distance vision. Needles shone silver. Alder stems threw narrow shadows. No body, no movement I could lock on. Just those tape ends, still rotating after whatever touched them had passed. At 1:03, I heard that deep exhale again. It came from somewhere ahead and right of camp, outside the beam edge, and it carried a chest resonance I felt through my sternum. I swung light, then stopped myself. Fast sweeps make you misshape an overread glare. I worked in short arcs, trunk to trunk, ground to knee height, knee to chest, then back. Nothing. Ranger gave a faint whining sound and scratched once at the gravel under the truck as if he wanted to burrow deeper. I kept scanning and counted breaths to slow my pulse. 10 in, 10 out. My father had taught me that when I was 16 and panicking on black ice with a trailer sliding. It worked then. It did not work much here. At 1:19, I clicked the headlamp on because my flashlight batteries were dropping and I needed both hands free. The beam narrowed the world to a hard white cone. I pointed it upslope between 2 fir trunks where the duff rose into shadow, and I saw them. 2 reflections, amber green, level with each other, steady. They were not low, like a deer caught feeding. Not shoulder height like a bear on all fours. They sat high, at what I judged to be roughly 7 feet from the ground where the slope broke. And they were too far apart for any cathead I had ever seen. The distance was maybe 35 yards, maybe 40. Hard to judge in black timber with no depth cues. The eyes did not bob. They did not dip and rise with breathing. They held exactly still, fixed on me with a flat patience that made my knees go weak. I froze for half a heartbeat, then brought the rifle up from the tailgate in one motion and shouldered it, sighting into the beam. The reflections blinked once, lids crossing sideways too fast for me to process, and both lights vanished at the same instant. Not a turn-away fade, not a drop to ground where I could track them, just present, and then gone. I kept the sights on that gap, waiting for branch noise, brush crack, furtive footfall, anything to map movement. Nothing came. The dark sat there like it had swallowed an object whole. The musk hit harder a second later, and along with it came that low, controlled breath. Closer now, then silence again. I did not fire. People ask why when I tell this part, and I have replayed it enough to answer cleanly. I did not fire because I had no body target, only reflected light, and I would not send a round blind into timber, where ricochet can come back ugly. I did not fire because I still hoped this could be something with a name I already knew. And shooting first at unknown shape in the dark is how men hurt themselves. Mostly I did not fire because in that exact second I understood I was not facing an animal blundering into camp. I was in a stare exchange with something that had chosen position and was reading me back. I stayed on sights for what felt like forever, then lowered the rifle an inch and listened. My ears started pulling apart layers, lights creak at left, tarp edge ticking against cord, my own breath, ranger's faster breath, and beyond that, almost too faint, a single step placed deliberately in damp duff behind the line of sight where the eyes had been, not retreating downhill, sliding laterally along contour, repositioning. I moved 2 paces toward the truck to tighten my cover angle. Gravel crunched under my boots louder than it should have. The cup alarm near the cooler trembled and gave one tiny ping, then went still. I scanned low and high, forcing my beam to dwell on each gap instead of chasing every shadow. The camp looked ordinary in slices. Cooler, fire ring stones, tarp, bow saw, stump, fern. Between slices, it looked like a trap I had built for myself. My brain kept throwing me explanations, one after another, like cards from a marked deck. Elk in weird light. Owl reflection on wet bark. 2 separate animals aligned by chance. I argued each one down in real time. Elk eyes are lower and move with head toss. Owl reflection is brief and wrong color in this lamp. Chance alignment does not blink in sync and disappear without displacement noise. I tried a new card. Maybe slope illusion made the height look wrong. I looked again at the trunk seam where I had seen them and used my tape marker tied at shoulder level as reference. No, even allowing for grade, those eyes had sat too high for any quadruped standing naturally. I told myself, keep functioning. Fear can ride in the passenger seat, but it does not steer. I clipped Ranger's lead to my belt and crouched to pull him out. He resisted, claws scraping. Then came only when I put both hands under his chest and dragged him clear. He stayed pressed to my leg, trembling so hard I could feel each shiver through my rain pants. I led him into the tent for 30 seconds to settle him, then brought him back to the truck so I could maintain line of sight. He would not look anywhere except upslope. When I touched his neck, his fur was damp and cold. For the next hour, I did perimeter checks in a loop of 5 yards, pause, listen, scan. Twice I caught movement at the beam edge that vanished when centered, too smooth to call wind, too brief to call shape. Once I heard 2 footfalls behind the boulder at my rear and spun with the rifle up, only to find dark stone and dripping moss. I started counting intervals between sensory events to keep from spiraling. Smell at 134, sound at 141, tape contact at 149, nothing at 157. Pattern work, like reading road vibration before a blowout. It helped just enough to keep me from bolting blind into trees. Around 3, the pressure eased. Not gone, just shifted farther out. I could feel it in Ranger before I trusted it in myself. His breathing slowed from panic to hard alert, and he finally sat instead of crouching. I fed 2 sticks into the coals for minimal light, and stood with my back against the truck door until the eastern sky started losing black. I never went inside the tent. The thought of zipping nylon between me and whatever had looked in from 7 feet up made my skin crawl. Dawn came as a dim gray wash through fog, hanging low in the drainage. Everything looked flattened, colorless, and too close. I wanted to break camp right then and leave. But daylight check of sign mattered if I was going to explain anything to anyone, including myself. I leashed Ranger short, slung the shotgun, and walked the uphill perimeter where the eyes had appeared. Ground there was fir needles over old roots, bad for clean prints. But I found 2 disturbances. One shallow compression near a stump at knee height, and one deeper push-out in damp duff a few feet farther right. Both angled as if something heavy had shifted weight and pivoted. No claw marks on trunk. No hair snagged where I could collect it. Just pressure and absence. I pushed farther onto the old skid trail that crossed above camp and followed it toward a slash opening maybe 80 yards away. Fog moved in strips between trunks, thin enough to see through 1 second and opaque the next. Ranger balked every 10 steps, looking back toward camp, then forward again. My watch read 6:12 when I reached the opening edge. That was where I saw the silhouette. At first it looked like a dark vertical break moving across paler background, no detail, just a section of morning turned solid. Then it stepped fully into the gap between 2 slash piles and scale, hit me like a physical blow, shoulders broader than any man in winter layers, torso deep through the chest, tapering hard toward the waist, head thrust forward from a neck set too upright for a normal animal profile. It was maybe 60 yards out, maybe a touch more. Crossing left to right on the old trail bench above me. It moved on 2 legs, not a bear popping up to scent, swaying, dropping, not a stagger. It took 12, maybe 15 deliberate bipedal steps with a rolling gait that kept the upper body steady while the lower frame absorbed terrain. The arms hung long and slightly flexed, ending below what would be mid-thigh on a person that size. Even at distance, the limb proportions looked wrong, as if multiple known patterns had been stitched together and made to work anyway. I tracked it through the fog gaps, with the shotgun half raised, and forgot to breathe. Then it reached a berm where the skid trail cut into old spoil. Without hesitation, it dropped forward, hands touching down for balance, and climbed the rise in one smooth motion that was too practiced to be accidental. No scramble, no slip. Up and over, using both lower limbs and forelimbs in a way that looked efficient. Then back upright near the top before disappearing behind young fur regeneration. The whole crossing lasted maybe 6 seconds, maybe 8. Long enough for certainty, not long enough for comfort. Ranger made a sound I'd never heard from him before or since. Not bark, not whine. A low, choked keening that ended in a cough. He flattened to the trail and tried to pull backward hard enough to choke himself. I snapped out of my stare, crouched, and hauled him in close by the harness handle, eyes still on the berm line where the silhouette vanished. Fog closed and opened there twice. Nothing reappeared. I moved us off the trail into cover behind a blowdown and listened. Branch drip, creak below, my pulse hammering in my ears. No crash retreat, no vocalization, no obvious departure. I stayed tucked for a full minute, maybe more, then eased to a kneel and glassed the berm with binoculars. Through the haze, I caught one fresh displacement in loose shale near the crest. Stones recently kicked down slope, and a strip of bark shaved from a sapling about chest high to me. No full track, just hints of mass and direction. I wanted a clear print, badly enough it almost hurt. What I had was motion memory and proportions burned into my head. I backed us to camp without turning my back on that opening, step by step, shotgun pointed high. Ranger pressed against my knee. Every 20 feet I stopped and listened for pursuit. None came. At camp, I checked tape markers. 2 uphill strips were gone completely. One lay 15 yards out, snagged on a branch at about my shoulder height. The knot end was frayed as if pulled fast against bark. I packed half my gear before I realized I was doing it automatically. Stove folded, tarp down, ammo counted, med kit in the cab. Then I stopped, sat on the tailgate, and tried to force my mind into a rational lane. Morning fog can distort size. Stress can stretch memory. Bears can show odd locomotion when injured. Men can misread distance and cut blocks. I stacked those thoughts like sandbags and leaned against them hard. The problem was each one failed against one or more hard points. Bears do not carry shoulder breadth and neck set like that, while walking upright for that many steps. Men that size do not move through slash in silence on a grade and then drop to 4-point locomotion without losing speed. Distortion can blur edges, but it does not invent anatomy. I sat there with Ranger glued to my boot and repeated the old words anyway, because I needed them to keep functioning for the next decision. It was light tricks. It was fog. It was fatigue. It was anything except what I knew I had just watched cross that trail, like it belonged there, and had all the time in the world. It was light tricks. It was fog. It was fatigue. It was anything except what I knew I had just watched cross that trail, like it belonged there and had all the time in the world. I sat there and tried to hold both versions at once. The practical one I had trusted my whole life and the one my eyes had forced on me, and the gap between them made me feel sick. Ranger leaned against my shin, shaking in short bursts, then going still, then shaking again. I set the shotgun down, dug my fingers into my face, and told myself out loud, quiet as a prayer, that I needed a sequence. Not courage, not certainty, just sequence. Pack in order, check road, drive out. I finished breaking the easy stuff first. Cot folded, stove boxed. Tarp rolled wet and tied anyway. I kept glancing upslope every 10 seconds like my neck had a spring in it. The clearing felt smaller than it had the day before. My truck looked wrong too, less like a way out and more like a piece on a board somebody else was moving around. I loaded the tailgate and reached for my green wool cap on the passenger seat. Gone. I stopped and looked around, annoyed at myself at first. I checked the floorboard, under the dash, behind the seat. Every place gear migrates. When roads shake it loose. Nothing. I had worn that cap at dawn. I remembered taking it off when I started sweating on the climb to the repeater ridge. I figured I'd left it on a stump. I walked camp and checked every stump. No cap. That should have been small, just a missing piece of clothing. Instead, it landed heavy because my camp was not big enough to misplace things in. I moved through the rest of the loadout with Ranger tied to my belt, and twice he tried to drag backward hard enough to flip himself when I angled near the uphill edge. I got the truck mostly packed by late morning, climbed in, and turned the key. Engine caught first try. I put it in gear, rolled 10 yards toward the spur, and stopped at a fresh tangle of fir tops where one of the younger trees had come down across the narrow cut. It was not a giant trunk. I could clear it in 20 minutes with a saw if my hands stayed steady. I stepped out, saw in hand, took 2 cuts, and Ranger started growling low, not at the roadblock in front of us, but at the trees off my left shoulder where the ground dipped toward alder. I backed up from that tree without finishing the cut. That was the first decision that cost me a day. I could have forced through then, maybe clipped branches and gone anyway. But my confidence had dropped below the line, where rushing helps. I looked at the slope, looked at Ranger, and decided to wait for better light and keep the truck pointed out. Noon passed with thin rain that came and went in curtains. I tried the radio twice from camp and got broken static both times. On the third try, I got Wayne for about 30 seconds. He said, "You still up there?" "Yeah. Road's got a tree down. I can cut it." Silence for a beat, then, "You alone right now?" "Me and Ranger." "Then do it in open sight only. If you lose visual past 30 yards, stop what you're doing and move." I asked him what he had seen on his end, what crews were actually running into, and static swallowed half his answer. The only clean words I got were, "Smart enough," and "Do not let dark catch you in timber." The channel died after that. I stood there holding dead radio hiss and felt like I had called a man on shore from deep water and got told to keep swimming. By mid-afternoon, the rain eased to mist. I made myself eat, though jerky tasted like cardboard. Ranger refused water until I knelt with the bowl and held it for him. Every routine had become negotiation. I took the saw and cleared enough branches from the fallen fir to give my front bumper room, then dragged the tops aside in short bursts, stopping each time Ranger stiffened. Work helped for exactly as long as my arms burned. The second I paused, awareness rushed back in. I started noticing little things that did not fit random animal traffic. 3 new scratches on the truck's driver's side door skin, high and slightly curved, too narrow for branch scrape. Mud on the passenger mirror housing, not splash pattern from road spray, but smeared from above and down. My orange tape marker that I had tied at chest height now hanging from a limb almost 7 feet up, not intact, looped twice around the twig like fingers had threaded it there. I kept insisting ravens steal bright things. Wind moves loose gear. Rain makes marks look fresh. I had run out of convincing tone by then, but I kept saying the words, because silence let the other thought in. The other thought was that something had spent 2 nights close enough to map my habits. When I checked tape, where I set the gun, which side of camp I favored when I listened. I realized I had stopped moving naturally and started moving as if I were being graded. Late day light in that drainage always went fast once the ridge line cut the sun. 1 minute you had gray-green detail in the understory. The next minute, depth collapsed, and every gap looked like the same dark slot. I decided I wouldn't stay another full night. I would stage the truck, keep engine ready, and roll as soon as I had a clear lane and enough visibility to avoid ditching on the spur. Around sunset, I walked 20 yards beyond camp to check if fresh water had undercut the road edge. Young alder grew thick there, stems close together, leaves still slick from rain, enough to hide a deer body at 10 feet. Ranger stopped so hard, the lead snapped tight against my palm. He did not bark. He gave one thin whine and tucked close. Something moved behind the alder wall. Not a dash, not a jump. A measured edge forward into the last strip of filtered light, like it knew exactly how much of itself to show. First I saw fur, dark brown going almost black where wet clumps hung. Lighter underlayer matted along the chest, in ridges from old rain and mud. Then a muzzle pushed past 2 stems, elongated and heavy through the bridge. Lips pulled just enough to show pale points of canine without a full snarl. The nose was broader than a wolf's and set above a jaw that looked too deep, too muscular, like it could shear through green wood. The ears were high, triangular, pinned flat against the skull as Ranger made that whine again. Its forelimb shifted and came into view to the wrist. That was where my brain stalled. The limb ended in a hand-shaped paw. Not human, not cleanly canine. Long metacarpal structure, dark pads and claws curved down and forward in hooked arcs that caught the low light dull and wet. Each claw looked 2, maybe 3 inches beyond the fur line. The wrist rotated as it adjusted weight, and the motion was deliberate, almost careful, not the blunt placement you see in bears swatting brush aside. I could see the shoulder behind it, huge and rounded, then dropping into a narrow waist that vanished behind stems. It stood partly screened, but the scale was undeniable, even crouched. Too tall for any known predator in that posture, too balanced, too aware, and it was watching my hands. I know how that sounds, but I am telling you exactly what I saw. Its gaze did not lock on my face the way dogs do when they read expression. Its eyes tracked from my left hand on the lead to my right hand near the shotgun sling, then to the truck keys clipped at my belt, then back to the gun. Amber with a green edge where light hit at angle, lids narrow. No panic in them at all. Evaluation, distance, timing. I felt the old hunter's instinct in me, the part that measures wind and angle and shot ethics, and that part did not say predator in brush. It said decision maker. My body reacted before my pride did. Cold spread through my chest and down my arms so quickly, my fingers went numb around the lead. My jaw locked. Vision tunneled to muzzle, claws, eyes, then widened all at once, as if my brain tried to absorb the entire scene in one frame for later. I took one step backward, slow, keeping the shotgun low, because sudden motion felt like permission for it to close distance. Ranger pressed into my leg hard enough to bruise. The thing eased forward another inch, enough to reveal part of its throat and the upper curve of rib cage under patchy fur. I caught a line of old scar tissue on the left side where hair grew in uneven ropes. It inhaled, the chest expanded deep and slow, bellows-like, and the smell hit me fully for the first time. Wet dog, metal, rot, and something hot underneath, like engine oil on stone. I realized then I had stopped breathing. I forced air in through my nose and tasted that musk on the back of my tongue. My mind threw one last useless thought at me, that if I held still, maybe it would classify me as no threat and slide away. Then its upper lip twitched toward my right hand again, where my fingers had tightened on the sling. That tiny movement, that attention to tools, broke any leftover hope that this was random proximity. I backed us one step at a time to camp, never turning, boots, feeling for ground I could not see. The alder swallowed most of its body as the light dropped, but I kept catching pieces between stems. The line of muzzle, one eye flash, claw tips flexing open and closed against bark. It did not rush. It paced my retreat at parallel distance and stayed just inside cover, as if rehearsing the shape of my fear. When the truck filled my peripheral vision, I moved fast. I grabbed Ranger by the harness, shoved him into the rear cab space, slammed the door, and brought the shotgun up to shoulder height. I expected a charge from brush. None came. The alder stood still except for rain drip. Then, from just beyond that screen, came a low, compressed snarl, not loud, more like pressure, vented through clenched teeth. It slid through me like a voltage hit. My legs almost folded. I held on sights for a full minute, then 2 until my arms burned. Still nothing visible. The forest around camp had gone quiet in a way that felt engineered now, like sound itself had been pushed back to give me only the noise that mattered. I lowered the barrel by inches and started checking what had changed while I was at the road edge. The answer was too much. My cap was back, placed dead center on the hood where I could not miss it, wet and flattened, with a muddy print across the crown that was not boot tread and not tire pattern. My skinning knife, which I kept sheathed on the tailgate strap, lay on the ground 10 feet away, with the sheath untouched and the blade, half buried, point first in duff. My folded topo map had been pulled from the dash pocket and pinned under a stone on the passenger side running board. The stone was bigger than a softball and had not been there earlier. On the map, exactly across the narrow spur I'd planned to take out, 3 parallel wet streaks ran diagonally close and straight, as if something with claws had dragged once and lifted. I stood there and felt my mind split into channels. One channel cataloged facts. Objects moved. No signs of human boot traffic. Changes occurred in less than 10 minutes. Placement intentional. The other channel ran primal and loud. It can approach silently in daylight. It can touch your truck while you are nearby. It can manipulate objects. It can return things where you will see them. I tried to force the channels back together into one useful plan. I started with perimeter discipline. I checked under the truck, around the boulder, behind the tent, keeping muzzle angles tight and movement controlled. Ranger stayed in the cab, teeth bared, throwing his weight against the rear door every time I stepped out of his line of sight. At the fire ring, I found my metal cup alarm line cut clean through, not frayed like snagged cord. The free end had been braided around itself 3 times, a tight twist no branch could make. Near the cooler, 1 shell from the side saddle lay on the ground, 5 feet from where it should have been, brass dry despite drizzle, as if removed and set down recently. I had not dropped it. I knew I had not. I sat in the driver's seat with both doors locked and the engine off, hands on the wheel, and let the truth land without fighting it. I was not sharing space with an animal passing through. I was inside a pattern of contact. The steps around camp, the high tape, the blind behind the stump, the eyes at 1 a.m, the silhouette crossing the trail, the staged objects on my truck. All of it pointed one direction. It knew where I slept. It knew what I touched when I felt unsafe. It knew the shape of my exits and was testing them. Prey was the only word that fit how my body read that conclusion. Not in a dramatic way, just stripped down biology. Heart rate high and erratic. Hearing sharpened to micro sounds. Vision scanning edges for motion loops. Every instinct screaming to move now while some luck remained. I looked at Ranger in the rear view mirror. He was crouched low, eyes fixed past my shoulder at the tree line, drool hanging from one side of his mouth, trembling but ready to launch if a door opened wrong. He had understood this before I had. Rain thickened again, tapping the cab roof in fast, uneven bursts. Dusk was almost gone. If I waited for full dark, I would lose road detail. If I pushed now, I risked moving with it still close and tracking. I chose movement. I slid shells into my pocket, checked chamber by touch, clipped the radio to my belt, and set a road flare in the cup holder where I could grab it one-handed. Keys went into the ignition, but I did not start yet. I listened for 30 seconds, then 60. From the timber uphill, just beyond the last tape marker, I heard 3 slow steps, matching the rhythm I had heard the night before. Not approaching, parallel, keeping pace with the truck before it even moved. I turned the key and the engine caught hard, diesel knocking loud enough to make the cab vibrate. The sound should have made me feel less alone. It did the opposite. It told anything within 100 yards exactly where I was and what I was about to try. I kept my foot on the brake, grabbed the handheld, and keyed the repeater with my thumb, pressed so hard it hurt. Wayne, Jim, anybody on East Tract? This is Glenn Ford at Spur 93 by Creek Bend. I need to check on road access now. Immediate. Static answered, thin and ragged. Then half a voice, clipped by interference, not enough to identify. I tried again, switched channels, tried the old logging simplex, then emergency weather band out of pure habit. Nothing clean came back. I pulled my phone and checked anyway, knowing better. No service. Black bars, dead icon, useless glass. Ranger whined in the back seat and scratched at the divider until the plastic creaked. The 3 steps came again from uphill timber, same spacing, same measured weight, now moving parallel with my driver's side door. I could not see it. I could hear exactly enough to picture where it was. I eased off the brake and rolled forward at walking speed. Headlights cutting through rain and hanging mist. The truck nose reached the narrowed section where I had half cleared the fallen fir. Branches scraped both sides with a sound like fingernails across tin. I kept one hand on the wheel, one on the shotgun laid across my lap, and watched my mirrors more than the road. At the choke point, my right tire slid off the packed center into soft shoulder mud and spun once. The truck lurched sideways, bumper kissing a stump. I swore, shifted to low, rocked back 6 inches, then eased forward again. Branch tips snapped under the frame. For a second, I thought I was going to high center and die there 10 yards from camp with the engine running and nowhere to move. Then the rear tire caught and climbed, and the truck pushed through into the next stretch of spur. I did not feel relief. The steps kept pace in the trees. Every 50 yards I hit the horn once. Long blast. Partly to warn any crew rig nearby, mostly to flood the dark with noise that was mine. The sound bounced off trunks and died fast. Between blasts, I heard movement tracking me high on the bank to my left, then crossing behind through younger fir where headlights could not penetrate. It never rushed. It stayed even with me. That was the part that stripped me down. It was not chasing, it was escorting. I keyed the radio again. Any unit near South Hall route, respond. I am moving from 9-3 Spur to Maine. Possible large predator aggressive tracking vehicle. This time Wayne's voice broke through in bursts, words shredded by static. Keep moving. Do not stop. Loader on active haul, maybe 10 minutes out. Wayne, what is it? Static. Then one clear sentence. Do not let it choose where you stand. The signal dropped. I drove faster than the road deserved. Rain thickened and turned the windshield into moving glass. Wipers slapped at full speed and still left smears. Twice I clipped slash piles with my mirrors. Once the rear kicked out on loose rock, and I corrected by instinct, the same way I had corrected loaded trailers on winter grades. Except this time, my pulse was so high, my hands felt detached from my arms. Ranger had gone silent, which scared me more than the whining. In the rear view, I could see only his eyes, wide and locked over my shoulder at the back window. The spur bent around, a cut bank, and dropped toward a narrow bridge of old timbers over runoff. Halfway down, both headlights caught 2 amber-green points between trunks on the inside corner, too high, too level. They held for 1 second, maybe less. then disappeared as the truck bounced through the dip. I slammed the horn and kept moving, but my foot came off the accelerator without permission. I forced it back down. I used to joke that solo camp trips were my cheap therapy because trees did not ask questions and dirt roads did not lie. That line felt smart for years. Driving that spur in rain with something pacing me in the dark, I understood the joke had always been on me. Roads can lie by omission. They tell you where to go, not what is waiting when you get there. A quarter-mile later, the road widened into an old landing scarred by loader tracks and shale piles. I needed that opening to swing around a washout on the right edge, so I slowed and took it wide. The second I entered the clearing, the truck lights swept across the far tree line and caught movement coming straight out of it. Not a glimpse, not a partial. Full body and hard white beam at roughly 20 yards. It stood upright and kept standing. The first thing that hit me was scale. It was around 8 feet tall on those legs, maybe a little less hunched, with a rib cage so deep it looked barrel-built, then narrowing sharply at the waist, before the hips flared back into digitigrade legs that loaded like springs. The thighs were thick, ropey with muscle under dark matted fur. Lower legs angled backward at the hock, and then down into broad splayed feet that gripped shale without sliding. Nothing about that stance belonged to any bear I had ever seen. Its shoulders were enormous, rolling under black-brown fur clumped by rain, with patchy sections where old scars had broken regrowth into uneven ridges. One long scar tracked along the left flank, pale skin showing through in jagged strips from rib to hip. Its forelimbs hung long, elbows set higher than I expected. Wrists canted inward slightly. The hands were the same impossible hybrid I had seen in Alder, but now undeniable in full light. Elongated palms, thick, dark pads, and hooked claws, catching reflections like dull knives. When it flexed them, water flicked off in arcs. The head was wolf-like in shape, but wrong in proportion to the neck and torso. Muzzle long and heavy, nose broad, lips drawn back enough to expose canines that looked built for puncture and hold, not display. Ears pinned flat. Eyes amber with a green edge in the headlight spill. Set forward with an attention that felt focused, not feral scatter. Its neck rose too upright before angling into the shoulders, giving it a posture that was half predator, half something that had learned to use height as leverage. It breathed in deep, rhythmic pulls, chest expanding and collapsing like a bellows. Each exhale fogged in front of its muzzle despite the rain. Then it opened its mouth and made a sound I had no category for, compressed and violent. Part snarl, part bark forced through a human-tight throat. It punched straight through me. Ranger exploded into barking behind me, hoarse and frantic. I braked hard, and the truck slewed sideways, engine still running. For one frozen instant, we stared at each other through rain and headlight glare. I saw its eyes flick to my left hand, then to the shotgun, then back to my center line. Recognition, assessment. I realized I'd stopped breathing again. Then it came. It did not lope like a bear or bound like a cat. It accelerated in 3 long strides, upper body low, forelimbs driving in sync with those hind legs, rock and mud kicking behind it. I bailed out the driver door with the shotgun and slammed into the front quarter panel, using the engine block as cover exactly the way I had practiced in range drills and never expected to use outside paper targets. The creature hit the hood with a metallic boom that dented steel inward. Windshield glass crazed in a white web. Ranger screamed in the cab. I fired the first slug low and left as a check shot, not a kill shot, because I needed one fraction of hesitation more than I needed certainty. The blast lit rain in a cone. The slug struck gravel near its lead foot and showered sparks and shale. It flinched, checked stride for half a beat, then raked one claw across the hood edge, peeling metal like thin bark. My ears rang instantly. I smelled burned powder and hot oil and wet fur all at once. I ducked, racked the action, and backed along the bumper toward the passenger side while keeping the muzzle up. It dropped off the hood to the ground in front of me, shoulders rolling, head low, breath pumping steam. The distance was maybe 12 feet now. I grabbed the road flare from my jacket pocket with my support hand, cracked the cap on the bumper, and struck it against the striker strip by feel. It ignited in a hard red hiss, throwing sparks and smoke. I kicked it under the front axle and at the same time leaned on the horn with my hip. Light, noise, smoke, engine heat, all layered at once. The creature recoiled a step, head jerking, eyes narrowing against the flare glare. That one step gave me angle on its left flank, the scarred side. I fired the second slug into that scar line just behind the forward rib. Impact drove a visible shudder through the torso. It snapped its head toward me and launched anyway, clipping the hood and crashing onto the near fender instead of full center mass. The force threw shattered windshield glass across my left forearm and face. Pain came hot and stinging, then distant under adrenaline. The flare sputtered brighter under the axle, painting everything in red-white pulses. The creature lost footing on the slick metal and slid off toward the ditch. Loose shale at the edge collapsed under its weight in a grinding cascade. It dropped shoulder first into the drainage cut, claws tearing furrows in mud as it fought for purchase. That was the window. Half a second, maybe one. I yanked the passenger rear door, grabbed Ranger by the harness, and shoved him fully onto the floorboard when he tried to leap out toward the noise. He twisted and snapped from panic, then recognized my grip and tucked in. I slammed the door, dove behind the wheel, and mashed the clutch so hard my knee cracked against the column. Low gear, throttle, wheels spinning, then biting. The truck jumped forward through slash at the edge of the landing, branches hammering the undercarriage. Behind me, a roar snarl burst, hit the cab like a physical shove. I checked the mirror and caught it hauling itself out of the ditch. One shoulder lower now, gait uneven for 2 strides, then correcting. It followed to the edge of the clearing but didn't close the final distance immediately. The flare glow and horn blast were behind us now. Darkness reclaimed the road. I drove blind fast, too fast, tires fishtailing on wet gravel. Ranger braced against the seatbacks, growling nonstop toward the rear glass. Twice I expected impact from behind and flinched before nothing came. I kept the horn down in pulses and rode the center crown until the spur fed into the active haul road. The transition lip hit us hard enough to lift the rear axle. I almost lost it, corrected, and then saw what might have been the best sight of my life. Twin floodlights coming downhill from the north bend, high mounted on a loader moving toward me. I flashed my high beams and laid on the horn. The loader operator answered with a long air horn blast and swung wide to block part of the lane, floodlights washing the tree line in brutal white. I glanced left in that wash and saw the creature one last time at the timber edge, upright again, but quarter turned away, eyes reflecting hard gold. It held there 2 beats, chest pumping. Then it stepped backward into black and was gone. Not sprinting away, just gone behind trunks and shadow where the lights could not hold it. I did not stop to test whether it would return. I blew past the loader at 20, maybe 25. Fish-tailed once on mud and kept driving for the checkpoint shack near the mainline junction. My hands were slipping on the wheel from rain and blood and sweat. My forearm burned where glass had cut through my sleeve. Powder sting bit across my left hand, where I had fired close to the metal body panel. My ears rang so loud I could barely hear the engine. The checkpoint lights came into view through rain like a dock after open water. I rolled in crooked, braked too late, and clipped a stack of spare culvert rings with the rear bumper. The truck died when I stalled it, and for a second I could not make my fingers open from the steering wheel. Ranger pressed his head into my shoulder from behind and shook against me, both of us still keyed to a threat that was no longer in front of us but not far enough behind to trust. A night mechanic I knew, Luis, came running from the shed in a rain jacket, yelling something I could not parse over the ringing. He got to my door, looked at the hood dents and fractured windshield, then at my arm, and his face changed from irritation to alarm in one blink. "Glenn, what hit you?" I tried to answer and got 3 words out, rough and useless. "Not a bear." Luis stared at me for a beat, rain running off his hood, then grabbed my sleeve and pulled me toward the checkpoint shack. "Sit down right there. Do not pass out on me." I sat on an overturned bucket just inside the door while he snapped open a field kit from the wall cabinet. Under the fluorescent lights, my forearm looked worse than it had in the cab. Glass cuts stitched across the skin in fine, crooked lines. Blood thinned by rainwater. My left hand was already swelling at the base of the thumb. Powder burns darkening near the knuckle. I could not stop shaking. Not little tremors. Full-body shivers that made the metal bucket rattle under me. Ranger stayed pressed against my leg, soaked and wild-eyed, growling whenever anyone moved behind us. Luis worked fast, rinsing grit out of the cuts with saline, wrapping pressure gauze, taping it down with hard, efficient pulls that stung enough to make me hiss through my teeth. "What hit the hood, Glenn?" I swallowed and looked past him to the open doorway where rain slanted through the floodlights. "I told you, not a bear." He nodded once, like he had decided not to argue with a man in shock. A loader rolled up outside, lights blazing, and Wayne climbed down from the cab. I had never seen him move that quickly. He ducked into the shack, took one look at the windshield, then at me, and his jaw set. "You stay awake," he said. "Luis, keys. I am taking him to urgent care." I remember the drive in pieces. Heater blasting, my wet clothes steaming, Ranger whining in the back whenever we passed dark tree lines. Wayne kept one hand on the wheel and one hand near the radio mic, calling ahead so the clinic would be ready. At a red light near town, he finally spoke, without looking at me. "Did it get in the cab?" "No." "Did it break contact after the second shot?" "Yeah, at the Hall Road." He nodded just once. "Then you did the right thing." Urgent care smelled like antiseptic and coffee gone stale on a hot plate. A nurse with tired eyes cut my sleeve away and picked glass from my arm, while another checked my pupils and blood pressure 3 times because the first 2 readings were through the roof. When the physician asked what happened, I heard myself say the words like they belonged to someone else. "Animal strike on a logging spur. Windshield blew in." "Bear?" "Large animal." Did not get a clean look. That lie sat in my throat like gravel, but I was not ready to tell the truth to a clipboard and a billing code. They irrigated the cuts, dressed the burns, gave me a tetanus booster, and told me to watch for infection. While they worked, I kept seeing the flare light under the axle and those eyes tracking my hands. At one point, I asked what time it was for the fourth time in 10 minutes, and the nurse rested her palm on my shoulder and said, "You are safe here." I nodded because she deserved agreement, but my body did not believe it yet. By dawn, Wayne drove us back to my rental. He parked under the dead motion light, sat with the engine idling, and looked at me square. "File your truck damage. Keep the coordinates tight. And Glenn, do not let anybody laugh you out of what you saw." I said, "What did you see before, Wayne?" He looked toward the trees past my driveway, then back to the dash. "Enough." The company office opened at 7. I showed up in clean clothes, with my arm wrapped and a headache that felt like a steel band around my skull. My foreman met me by dispatch, with a face that mixed concern and calculation, the way managers look when they are weighing a man against a liability report. We sat in the safety office, with a dented fan heater humming in the corner, and I filled out the form by hand. Incident type: vehicle damage. Contributing factors: low visibility, roadway obstruction, unknown large animal presence. Injuries: minor lacerations and burns. Recommended action: temporary route hazard flag on East Spur 93. The safety coordinator tapped the line that said, "Unknown large animal." State wildlife report. I kept my eyes on the paper. Not at this time. By noon, a deputy stopped by to review the photos I'd taken of tracks and camp sign. I spread them on the desk, knife scale visible next to each print. He looked at them for less than a minute and slid them back with 2 fingers. Wet duff distorts edges. Could be bare, could be overlap from older impressions. Hard to call anything from this. I said, "You can see toe spacing and forward load." He shrugged. "I can see mud." That ended any urge I had to file a full wildlife statement. I filed what I had to for insurance and equipment damage, nothing more. On paper, it stayed an animal strike and route hazard. Off paper, it stayed with me. That evening, I met Wayne in the back corner of the diner lot after dark. Rain misted under the sodium lights. I handed him a flash drive with the print photos, the map pin, and a voice memo I had recorded in my truck, while details were still sharp. He listened to the first minute through one earbud, eyes narrowed. When it finished, he pocketed the drive and said, 3 crews in 6 years had night contact east of your camp. Not all on the same spur. One guy quit next week, one transferred. One stopped talking about it after folks gave him grief. Why did nobody flag it? His mouth tightened. Because nothing official ever stuck. No carcass, no clean samples, no statement that survived jokes. So routes got changed quiet instead. I stood there with rain collecting on my jacket and felt that isolation settle in. You can survive contact and still feel alone with it. 2 friends from the yard proved that part fast. Jim and Aaron tried to turn it into a story at lunch 2 days later, laughing about me fighting a ghost bear in the rain. I told them once to drop it. They did not. I stopped sitting with them. After that, calls got shorter, then stopped. The changes in my life started with a sale counter and a cardboard box. I brought in my lightweight solo hunting setup, the wall tent cut down, ultralight stove, compact cot, all the gear I used for 3-day loops alone. The young guy at consignment scanned tags and asked if I was upgrading. I said, no. I am done with solo backcountry." He looked up, surprised, then rang the items without another question. I signed the receipt with my bandaged hand and sat in my truck afterward for 10 minutes, staring at the empty bed. At work, I requested route reassignment. That meant less money and less status, because long-haul timber runs are where you prove yourself. But I took daylight aggregate routes near town and did not argue. Dispatch raised an eyebrow. "You sure? You built your rep on mountain loads?" "I am sure." My routines narrowed on purpose. I hunted only in groups, never after dusk, and only in areas with open sight lines and 2 known exits. I stopped taking my nephews into deep timber at all. That one caused friction with my sister at first. She watched me check her back porch light twice during a Sunday cookout and finally said, "Glenn, they are boys, not glass." I took her to the shop where my pickup sat waiting on parts and showed her the hood dents under the work lights, the claw scoring that ran in clean arcs through paint and primer. She put her hand over her mouth and did not speak for a long time. That night at her kitchen table, I said, "I am not trying to scare them. I'm trying to keep us in places where we can see what is coming." She nodded slowly. "Then we use your rules." We wrote them on a notepad and stuck it to her fridge. No trails near dark, no splitting up, check-in times fixed, vehicles always faced out. It felt excessive until it felt normal. At my rental, I installed motion lights on all 4 corners, reinforced strike plates in both exterior door frames, and mounted trail cameras covering the driveway and tree line. The first week I slept with the hallway light on and Ranger's bed pulled against my bedroom door. 2 months later, I moved anyway, 20 minutes closer to a larger town corridor where houses sat nearer together and street lights cut the dark into smaller pieces. I am still alive, still employed, and still in Oregon. I run daylight aggregate, mostly quarry to plant and back, home most evenings before full dark. Ranger is older now, gray around the muzzle, slower on stairs, still glued to me when rain starts. On heavy weather nights, sleep comes in short blocks. If wind pushes water against the windows in bursts, I wake with my heart already racing, listening for footfalls that are not there. Therapy helped once I found the right person, someone who didn't need me to prove the creature fit a known catalog before she treated the fear as real. We worked on grounding drills, breath counts, sensory resets, and the difference between caution and captivity. A few retired military guys from our wider logging circle taught me practical techniques too. Things they used after deployment: map exits on arrival, anchor your eyes on fixed points when adrenaline spikes, name 5 physical objects in order to pull your brain out of threat loops. I still use those every week. I also did controlled exposure on my own terms, open terrain only, daylight only, 2 partners minimum. First time back on a ridge trail, my hands shook so badly I dropped my water bottle twice. I stayed anyway, finished the loop, and drove home wrung out, but steadier. That is what recovery looked like for me. Not forgetting. Rebuilding function around memory. There are lasting effects I do not pretend away. Eye shine at tree line height still hits me like a switch. I check locks and exits in any rural building without thinking. I do not camp where timber closes within 20 yards of my sleeping spot. If someone calls me paranoid, I let it pass. Labels do not matter much after you have watched something test your perimeter like a mechanic checks bolts. The immediate threat ended that night on the Hall Road. I got out, I changed my work, I changed my habits, and I stopped giving that drainage access to me. No one has called me back to that spur with new damage. and I have never gone looking for a second confirmation. I already had enough. I know what watched my campsite for 3 days was flesh and weight and intent. I know it could move, silent through rain and slash, and I know it learned fast. Beyond that, I have no neat answer for you, no file number, no species chart that makes it tidy. I hauled past every kind of wildlife this state can name, hunted these woods since high school, and trusted my own read of sign for most of my life. What I saw out there fit none of it. My story is not a warning wrapped in drama. It is a record from a man who came back and built a different life because he wanted to keep coming back.